So I think let me begin while others join. So first of all, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to the fourth Hetukar Jha Memorial Lecture. Let me say a few words about Professor Hetukar Jha. Professor Jha was born in 1944 and passed away in 2017. He retired as a professor of sociology from Patna University. His achievements as a sociologist and his efforts in developing the field of historical sociology are well known in academia. He was a prolific writer. Some of his notable works are Social Structures and Alignments, a study of rural Bihar, which was published in 1985. Social Structures of Indian Villages, a study of rural Bihar, which was published in 1991. And Historical Sociology in India, which was published by Routledge in 2015. And there are many other books as well as journal articles. As a passionate and rigorous collector of historical documents and a builder of archives, his contributions are invaluable and unparalleled. Publications of more than two dozen historical documents from Kalyani Foundation, of which he was the trustee, bear testimony to his endeavors. His knowledge of documents on Bihar and its villages was surpassed by none. At the time of his demise, he had collected a large number of documents, which included village notes relating to 6,000 villages in Bihar. He was engaged in writing a social history of villages in colonial Bihar and collected documents covering the entire period from 1894 to 1916. And it is a task that needs to be taken up from where he left. Hetukar Jha's association with our center began since its inception in 2016. He was part of the group of senior academics who provided invaluable inputs to scholars at the center on their respective research projects. Despite his failing health, Jha agreed to deliver the inaugural lecture at the first orientation program on migration organized by the center in 2017. As a mark of respect for Jha, the center instituted a memorial lecture in his name in 2018. Last year, we could not organize the lecture due to the raging coronavirus. The past memorial lectures were delivered by Professor Ratneswar Mishra, Professor Sabyasachi, and Professor Roma Chatterjee. Full text of previous lectures may be downloaded from Center's webpage. The center is also bringing out a commemorative volume dedicated to Professor Jha. Today's speaker is Dr. Parul Bhandari, a sociologist who specializes in the study of marriage, family, intimacies, modernity, and gender and class inequalities in contemporary India. She is the book reviews editor at Contributions to Indian Sociology and an honorary fellow at the Center for Multi-Level Federalism, Institute of Social Sciences in Delhi. Most recently, she was a visiting research scholar at the Institute of Asian and African Studies, Humboldt University, Berlin. Prior to this, she was an associate professor of sociology at O.P. Jindal Global University. She has authored three books. The latest one is Matchmaking in Middle Class India, Beyond Arranged and Love Marriages, which was published by Springer in 2020. And in preceding 2 years, 2019 and 2020, she published two more volumes. In 2019, a authored volume was published by Routledge. The title is Money, Culture, Class, Elite Women as Modern Subjects. And in 2018, the publication was from Springer, entitled Exploring Indian Modernities, Ideas and Practices. Besides, she has widely published in journals and edited volumes. She occasionally writes for newspapers and news portals. The title of today's lecture is Mythical Love and Conjugality in Everyday Life, Gender and Politics in India. The topic is complex yet topical given current contestations, politics, and violence around love marriage, living in relationship, LGBTQ, intimacies, intercaste, interfaith, and intra-gotra love and marriages. Without further ado, now I invite Dr. Parul Bhandari to deliver her lecture. We will have a question and answer session. After this session, you can write your questions in the chat box or you can raise your hand. So, Parul, it's over to you now.
Thank you so much, Professor Pushpendra. I'm just, it's a great honor to be delivering the fourth Hetukar Memorial Lecture. And I really want to thank Professor Sabyasachi and Professor Pushpendra for inviting me for this lecture, and also the very efficient team at TIS Patna for putting all of this together. It's been, in this world of all online glitches, it has been very easy. So thanks very much. I never had the good fortune of meeting Professor Jha, but I'm well too aware of his contribution to sociology and scholarship at large. Not only was he a distinguished scholar and an author, but also admired as a colleague, professor, and for being a generous human being. In fact, just yesterday, after the notice of this lecture had gone around, I was in conversation with Professor Ravinder Kaur, who's at IIT Delhi, and who's an esteemed scholar, and I follow her works very closely as our works do overlap. And she was actually mentioning how she had met with Professor Jha, and they've featured together in a conference and a book that came out of that conference. And then she said, he was a very nice man. So in today's world of deep inequalities, misfortune, pandemic, and the ongoing gruesome war, I think it is incredibly inspiring to be remembered not only as a scholar, but also as a good human being. So if your colleagues can remember you as that, I think it's just so incredibly inspiring. And with this, my intent is to remember Professor Jha not only for his academic contributions, but also for instilling the sense of happiness amongst the people that he met, and delivering this lecture today on what would have been his 78th birthday. I try and make sense of love in contemporary times by looking at our rich mythology and also juxtaposing it to our tricky politics. Now, the lecture is divided into 3 parts, and I hope they don't seem too disparate. And the context of the lecture, I have to forewarn, is urban, as most of the research and all the observations and thoughts that I will share with you today are from field work conducted amongst the professional middle class largely in Delhi. So let's see if let's see how this goes, and I'll be most happy to hear your comments and inputs on what you make of people's understanding of love in everyday life. Okay, so part 1 of the lecture. The late 1980s were a high point for Indian television, with the release of Ramanand Sagar's Ramayan in 1987 and B.R. Chopra's Mahabharata in 1988. And for those of us living under the rock, I'm guessing also younger generation particularly, who were unacquainted with the popularity of these two, dramas, which I think were really the OTT binge watching worth series before Netflix and OTT became as all-encompassing as they are now. The pandemic and its first lockdown would have been an entry point in understanding how popular these series were, because supposedly, and I say supposedly because one wonders about the politics of this move, supposedly these shows were brought back on national television almost after 33 years in March 22 due to popular demand. Now, there's no doubt that these two great Indian epics have captured the imagination of everyday Indians, as well as a global audience, as being the main anchors, if you will, of understanding Hindu Dharma. Now, I'm not an expert on Indian mythology, nor on Indian or Hindu political thought to delve into why and how these great epics have come to assume this position. However, as a scholar that's interested in studying intimacies of Indians, I'm intrigued by the place that these epics have occupied in the millennial, this young generation, this generation that's in their 30s and early 40s now, that is those born in 1980s. I'm interested in understanding the place of these epics in their understanding of their own sexualities, gender roles, and intimacies, particularly conjugality, right? That is, how do they perceive of a conjugal bond? What are the ideals of a good husband? What are the ideals of a good wife in that? Now, in my field work, beginning from doctoral work up until now, I get to speak to these millennials about their spousal preferences, romantic experiences, ideas of love, duty, fidelity. And unsurprisingly, the figure that emerges most strongly here is that of Ram Sita, right? Now, I say unsurprisingly, probably because it was this story, this narrative, this version of the great epic that was circulated in the late 1980s to this segment of the population that was growing up. So Ram, the Dharmpurush, and Sita, the dutiful wife, the heteronormative, monogamous image of an Indian god and goddesses is etched in our memory. Now, in my conversations with my interlocutor, Sita was often invoked, both by men and women, by the way, both by men and women, though more by men, as the giving woman, dutiful woman, but also a woman who stood her ground, right? And took the harsh step of bringing up her sons alone in the forest, away from the luxuries that the riches of Ayodhya had to offer. This, several men pointed out, who didn't want to come across as only desiring a woman who was very subservient to her husband. This, several men pointed out, was also Sita's agency, was it not? They often asked. And therefore, why should Sita not be seen, not be hailed as an idol for a modern yet traditional woman who follows her duty and loves her husband to stand by him in his time of difficulty, but can also stand her ground, particularly when accused of wrongdoings, and renunciate her riches? While women too spoke of Sita as an ideal wife, they also criticized the popular perception, much like the men, that Sita wasn't simply a plus one to Ram, right, who had little or no voice. And they too pointed out how she, time and again, asserted herself. But it was striking to note that none of the women said that they definitely aspired to be like Sita. There was a hesitation in accepting her as an all-encompassing idea of a good wife. One woman who was working at an MNC in Gurgaon said to me, "She didn't seem to have a lot of fun now, did she? Her life seemed to be only of penance." Then again, the life of all Indian wives seems to be of penance. So maybe Sita is, after all, the ideal Indian wife, whether we like it or not. Okay. Now, the other prominent figure in conversation on love, sacrifice, and especially unfulfilled love was Radha. Radha was, however, invoked in another context, the context of explaining love either as unreciprocated or unfulfilled or left at bay due to social pressures. Radha, after all, was never a wife. She was a devotee, the purest of lover, for she expected no social status in return, said one woman to me. Though she did get the ultimate social status, I remarked. After all, who remembers Rukmini more than Radha? My interlocutor paused at this interjection by me and said, "True, but still she isn't the wife. And you will never hear a man say he wants you to be dutiful like Radha. He will always say like Sita." Now, in that, there was a distinction. I figured out there was a distinction of categorization that was prevalent in the process of mapping of desires, conjugality, and ideas of love and duty. What was striking, however, to me was that there was no mention of any other mythological figure other than Sita, Radha, Draupadi, Kunti in the lexicon of the urban Indians that I was interacting with. Now, before I go on to explain why I think this could be the case, let me briefly discuss a few other mythological figures that I found appealing and intriguing. One, and I'm not sure how many are aware of this, let's see, but one of the mythological stories that I was most intrigued by in the context of Mahabharata or in the context of Arjun was that of Ulupi. Now, Ulupi is, of course, the Naga princess, and the myth has it that it was she who had captured Arjun when he was bathing in the river, and she was besotted by him. So one can say, if one has to use the modern kind of language, it was love at first sight from her end, and then she captures him, and then they marry. Chitrangada was another princess, a princess from Manipur, who was known as the warrior princess. Now, Chitrangada was had what one can call masculine features, and or rather personality, in that she She used to ride horses, and she used to, be involved in archery and things like that. There's also another myth which says that she was a folk tale, rather, that she thought that Arjuna wouldn't be attracted to this masculine idea of a princess, so she kind of feminized herself, but Arjun wasn't interested in that. He was actually more attracted to the masculine, the warrior princess image, so she goes back, transforms back into it, and anyway, they get together, they marry. Now, Chitrangada's father, Chitravahana, however, had a condition for the wedding, for the marriage. So he said that the son born out of this union will carry on Chitravahana's legacy. In other words, a matrilineal, way of looking at marriage that Arjuna undertakes with Chitrangada. Now, of course, it's not surprising that this folklore comes from Northeast, from Manipur, because as we know, as students of sociology, that matrilineal ways of kinship are prevalent in that part of India as well. Now, what was interesting to me was that these tales and these wives and these intimacies of Arjuna, however, were not a part of the grand B.R. Chopra Mahabharata that we grew up watching. In this rendition, we simply saw him as a devoted husband to Draupadi, who then also marries Krishna's sister Subhadra. But beyond that, there was no capturing of how many women desired him or how he desired other women. And the narrative mainly was on dutiful son, brother, cousin, who goes to war for the honor of his kingdom, his wife. Now, I'm not saying that each rendition of the Mahabharata must contain references to all the, what Meckham Marriott would call, little traditions. Nonetheless, as a scholar of intimacies, I am intrigued on how certain aspects of love and intimacy, amply available in our mythological literature, particularly where women take charge of their desires and sexualities and lineage, are forgotten. And the population grows up with more heteronormative ideas on love, marriage, sacrifice, and duty. Now, part of the answer of this question is, of course, in the circulation of images and stories, which in turn curates our understanding of our own history, and I dare say a selective history in that, one that suits current political times or future political and social projects. Okay, so I'll park this segment here. I'll go on to the part 2 of this lecture. Sheldon Pollock, in his seminal article, Ramayana and the Political Imagination in India, published in 1993, very important year right after Babri Masjid demolition, argues that Ramayana gained the momentous place that it has from 12th century onwards. So according to him, the reason of the popularity of Ramayana since 12th century, and particularly then in 20th century, was because, and I quote him, the text offers unique imaginative instruments. In fact, 2 linked instruments, whereby on the one hand, a divine political order can be conceptualized, narrated, and historically grounded, and on the other hand, a fully demonized other can be categorized, counterposed, and condemned. His argument is that what Ramayana offers is 2 things: divinization and demonization, right? And in this process of categorization, what is central is an othering. So othering was a central part of the grand narration of the Ramayana. But of course, we all know this as scholars interested in myths, sociology, that this version of Ramayana is not the only version, right? For example, in traditions in Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Ravan is not seen as the devil ever. It's either an anti-hero or at times even the hero. But Valmiki's Ramayana operates with this othering, that Ravan is quite literally stealing our women and is presented without question as a tyrant, perhaps even as a kind of oriental despot, Sheldon Pollock says. So to appreciate this othering even more and to extend it into the idea of conjugality and love, what I'm doing is taking a little bit from what Sheldon Pollock has also said, that let's try and compare it with Mahabharata, where the antagonists are actually not othered. They are what Pollock calls brothered. Now, I don't want to get into the details of this because I don't think I'm very much qualified to do so, as I'm not a political theorist. But what I'm taking from this, in juxtaposing this, and I'll unravel it further, is that even in the context of womanhood, even in the context of conjugality, Ramayana does present us with this othering, with this categorization, say, for example, Sita and Surupnakha. Now, the idealized version of the wife is Sita. Sita is demure, she's dutiful, she follows Ram, as opposed to the sexually active Surupnakha, who desires men, right? And therefore causes war. At the same time, mind you, at the same time, Sita too desires. So it's not that she doesn't have any desires. Sita too desires, but her desires are not sexual in nature, right? She desires to play with the deer. Now it's very interesting if you also look at the symbology of the deer. So the non-threatening, the sweet, the playful deer. She desires as well, but her desires are not threatening. Nonetheless, even when the non-threatening desires take over, it can cause war. She did ultimately cross the Lakshman Rekha, right? So in that sense, there's a lot of information which is being circulated on the idea of conjugality simply by this categorization, which is to say that there is a right way of being a woman, that there is a right way of desiring. And even if you slip in that right way, then you are susceptible to a punishment. Punishment in this sense that you will be stolen, you will be taken away, right? So the text glorifies a kind of woman, an ideal woman, but also reminds us that this kind of woman is also fallible, right? She too can falter. So when you cross the limits, you kind of pay for it. Now this is like my kind of extrapolation to the Sheldon Pollock's analysis of the othering that takes place in Ramayana. Now, my understanding is that in a time where the political efficacy of Ramayana is only being strengthened, it is completely hard to imagine multiple narratives of conjugality and ideal partners circulating through mass media, as these ones, the ones that these great texts are circulating, are used for for guiding our morals and norms and expectations of established institutions of marriage, right? So in that sense, Ramayana provides this kind of legitimized grand narrative of duty, kinship, sovereignty, and ideal womanhood. Now, Mahabharata is also popular, no doubt about it, but it falls short to provide this idealized construct. For firstly, one of the main female characters is Draupadi, who has 5 husbands. Now, of course, our rich and diverse country, as we all know, has established systems of polyandry, polygyny. Yet, these kinship and marriage practices directly clash with the narrative of the idealized devoted wife, which is propagated by the Ramayana, right? So, what I found in my conversations with women was that it's not that this clash was lost on them. This is to say that they were aware of the power of Ramayana and the kind of characters that have dominated their understanding of marriage. At the same time, they were slightly critical of it. For instance, one woman said to me, "Note how people are happy to name their daughters Sita, but never Draupadi." Now, author, feminist activists, and historians Urvashi Bhotalia and Charu Gupta have linked this gender politics to the politics of establishing national identity, particularly vis-a-vis minorities. They argue that the state's approach in the aftermath of the partition, particularly, was less focused on the rehabilitation of abducted women and more concerned on restoring the masculine honor of the nation, right? Which they thought was lost because the women were stolen, much like Ravan steals Sita. So the concern was, how do we restore the masculine honor? By restoring a patriarchal order, a patriarchal societal order publicly, but also domestically, right? In the domestic realm. Indeed, this is also David Scholl's argument when he analyzes how the idea of love jihad conjures up concerns of a Hindu family. And I quote him, "Love jihad activists portray relationships between hypersexualized Muslim men and Hindu women as a threat to the Hindu family and nation. While activists often propose violence and vigilance against Muslims as a means of eliminating the threat, they also promote traditional kin and gender roles as a means of protecting women from the Muslim menace. By conjuring interreligious relationships as threats to society's well-being, such campaigns presuppose and implicitly endorse an idealized moral order centered on the Hindu family. Okay, so it is here that the image of Sita becomes all-powerful, and the beautiful, invigorating, inspiring stories such as that of Radha take a back seat, because stories like that of Radha do not idealize a Hindu family. It is a story of another sort of love, of selfless devotion, yet one that is outside the realm of the family. It is indeed ironic that when devotees that throng Vrindavan greet each other as Radhe Radhe and make pilgrimages to Barsana, Radha's village, she is nonetheless not seen as the ideal gender role of a woman, no less of a wife, precisely because her love operates outside the patriarchal order of the family that a hyper-Hindu nation would want. Now, my women interlocutors were more than aware of these discrepancies than men. And there was an implicit acceptance that our mythological history is definitely rich, right? But there was an understanding that these myths are being interpreted to suit a particular vision of how India should be. Now, I asked what are for Lupi, Chitrangada, and Siri, and I realized that one of the reasons maybe that they're not that popular in the everyday lexicon of the women and men that I interacted was because, firstly, of course, they weren't circulated, because these stories weren't circulated in mass media, because probably they challenged the gender role that seems to be most befitting to a post-partition India particularly, but also perhaps because these stories also lie at the geographical periphery of India, right? So Lupi and Chitraganda are from Northeast and Siri from the South. So the question that also comes to my mind that I haven't yet explored and answered, but is that, has there been a heartland India whitewash, as it were, of our history too? Even if not these specific mythological characters, I mean, I invoke them because I find them incredibly powerful, there was a clear absence of any other characters in our conversations with my interlocutors other than characters as Sita, Radha, Draupadi in the everyday imagination of women and men, and how they were making sense of what they desire from their marriage. However, when I look beyond my interlocutors, when I look beyond this professional middle class of Delhi that I was interacting with, because after all, it is a small subset, I saw that there was not always such an acceptance of this sanitized version, and that precisely to upend political and the social project of ruling elites of India, several alternate movements have emerged through the power of media, global influences, as well as grassroots level initiatives that bring our attention back to our rich history and offer several points of emulation. Now, in the third part of this lecture, I'm going to discuss a few of these, I won't call them moments of, I won't call them resistances, but aspects that the public has brought forward, that has brought our attention to. So, in 2008, Indian-American artist Nina Pale directed a short animation film called Sita Sings the Blues, which was a roaring success. It's available on YouTube, by the way, so you all can watch it after this. This is a 1 hour, 20 minutes film providing a woman's perspective on the Ramayana, specifically focusing on the desires and vulnerabilities of Sita in accompanying and supporting Ram through his decisions and journey of Banvas and kingship. Now, interspersed with this grand narration of the Ramayana, rendition of the Ramayana, is Nina Pale's own experience of leaving San Francisco to accompany her husband to move to Trivandrum, where she's not quite getting the hang of India. She's trying to make sense of this space, while also dealing with her husband's increasing disinterest in their marriage, right? And in this process, probably after some fatigue, she decides to go back to San Francisco. And the moment she lands there and she opens her email, she finds an email from her husband stating that he wants to dissolve their marriage because he doesn't feel the love, right? So to that extent, Pale attempts to juxtapose a wife's sacrifices, hesitations, as well as desires from a strong traditional mythological context, which is how Sita may have felt while accompanying Ram, and then also being questioned for her chastity and then leaving to go and live alone in the forest, as well as juxtaposing that to the context of modern day marriages involving geographical relocation for professional advancement. Now, here I would like to say that overwhelmingly in my research, one of the reasons in which romantic experiences didn't translate into marriage was geographical relocations, people moving abroad because for better job opportunities or even to different parts of the city. It was really at that point that several, either men or women, said, we are not going to relocate. So in that sense, relocation and how easily or however that Sita did it is being juxtaposed in this film to what a modern woman would do, should do, can do, right? So in some ways, the context of Ramayana's Sita and Nina Pale are not that distinct. Right? One of the main differences being that modern Sita questions her move to India to follow her husband. She doesn't immediately agree to it and is very much critical of the growing disinterest by her husband in the marriage, and is very openly desiring a more satisfying and fulfilling marriage, and fulfilling emotionally as well as sexually, right? So the question remains, what is expected of a modern day Sita? Are most modern women subconsciously building themselves on this iconic image of the Sita and love, duty, and devotion that she has to offer for her marriage and her husband? Or they are beginning to be critical about it, questioning relocations, movements, dissatisfaction, emotional disconnect in marriages. And by the way, in Nina Pale's own experience, it was not, the marriage did not break down because of another woman, you know, the classic thing that many a times Bollywood tells us about, but it was just an emotional disconnect. And it was her desire to have more emotional connection with her husband, which also made her unhappy in the marriage. So this film then poses an important question on what an equal and happy marriage should look like. And is the conjugality and love as duty and devotion depicted in the Ramayana really an ideal that women would want to aspire to? Now, interestingly, it wasn't just Nina Pale who's rereading the Ramayana and its central conjugal relationship in this way, but several of my women interlocutors. They wondered if Ram-Sita marriage is really the ideal for the modern age. And they did not always have straight answers for it. So here I want to say this, that it's not that every woman was dissing the image of Sita, the icon Sita, but they were simply questioning. Of course, given the political attachment to the Ramayana and the centrality of Ram, this film did garner much backlash. And in April 2009, the Conjugality Samiti started a petition asking to ban the film and to take legal action against not just the director, but everyone who was involved in the making of the film. One can't help but wonder, was the outrage mainly at the poor depiction of Ram, because that is what Conjugality Samiti said, that Ram is not depicted in a nice way, or because the conjugal couple, the ideal conjugal couple that we all grow up watching, that we use in our everyday lexicon to make sense of Indian marriages, was unsettled on a global stage in a very light-hearted manner. It's an animation film, you know, and it's quite easy to watch. And also discussed in a very convincing way because it was interspersed with modern day marriage of an Indian couple between the US and India, right? So in other words, this film was in some ways about modern day tales of romance, commitment, sacrifice, and betrayal. So the question then is, was the outrage then at the fear that the population that will be watching this film will be demystified by the conjugal bliss that supposedly exists in this figure of Ram Sita, by seeing that it is, after all, women who are made to carry the mantle of marriage, honor, and duty, all in the name of love. What kind of love? Love for one's husband, community, nation, and kingdom, not necessarily self-love. Okay. So from media, I want to move to the power of social movements. We as sociologists are all too well aware of the power of social movements to upend and unsettle established ways of being, of hierarchies, social practices, and no doubt a powerful movement which has helped us question heteronormative and at times constraining ideas of love and intimacy is the LGBTQ movement. Now, I'm sure you're all aware that in 2013, a court had upheld the colonial era law, Section 377, which criminalized homosexuality as an unnatural act punishable for up to 10 years. Since then, we witnessed a long and arduous journey for reversing this judgment, and activists, scholars, and the general public contributed in showcasing that love sees no gender divisions. And finally, this was reversed in 2018 by the Supreme Court. This judgment was reversed on 6 September. And it was a momentous occasion for the general public at large, and particularly the efforts of the LGBTQ movement. Now, the movement in itself is so rich, and there's so many ways in which, as sociologists, we can analyze it. And it is not my intention to be reductive of the movement, but there are 2 aspects that I was most drawn towards while analyzing this movement in the context of my research interests. And first was how examples from our mythology were proudly quoted and appropriated to demonstrate and argue that we as a nation have always been, quote unquote, modern, that is. And when I say, when I use the term Indian mythology for the purposes of this paper, I'm focusing on Hindu mythologies, and that we've always been in this Indian tradition, we've always actually been supportive and accepting of a range of sexualities and intimacies. Now, I had mentioned earlier about Ulupi and Arjun, and one of the other reasons why I find this couple and this conjugal love and intimacy so appealing is because their son Aravan or Iravan, I don't know if you have heard much about this figure, is actually seen as a god for the transgender community. So the myth goes that when he was on his deathbed, his wish was that he did not want to die unmarried. He was unmarried at that point. So Krishna, avatar of Vishnu, takes his feminine form of Mohini, and he marries, or rather, she marries Iravan. And while Mohini, of course, we all know is seen as the Vishnu feminine avatar, but for the transgender community, she's actually seen as Iravan's widow and the hero's widow. And of course, the other more powerful figure is that of course, Shikhandi, born to take Amba's revenge as Amba's soul in that sense, and to kill Bhishma Pitama, who was to be killed by someone who's neither woman nor man, and not on the day, not on the night, that kind of. So Shikhandi is so incredibly powerful amongst the transgender communities. And very recently, I was attending a talk, I think 2 weeks ago, and somebody mentioned, I haven't got time to verify this, but somebody mentioned that in Vietnam, the LGBTQ community, the movement, Vietnam or Cambodia, there's a film which is called Daughters of Shikhandi, which a documentary that was made on the gay community and the transgender community there. So in that sense, that this figure is so powerful, not just for the LGBTQ community or movement in India, but of course in South Asia as well. So one aspect is that how mythological figures have been invoked by this movement. And the second striking aspect for me when I study this movement is its focus on love. Now, here I have studied in depth arguments of activist academic Ruth Vanita, who has just been an inspiring figure in this space. And she has extensively researched on this theme. And in one of her papers, on same-sex female couples and their notions of love, marriage, elopement, or of not being together, she cites an example of a couple that wants to marry in the US, and they want to marry under Hindu traditions. So they approach a Hindu priest. So the Hindu priest says to them that, allow me some time to ponder over whether I would want to preside over your marriage ceremony or not. And he comes back after a few days and agrees. So when asked by Vanita why he took this time, he said, no, I just wanted to figure out whether this is within the realm of Hindu marriage. And then he comes back to say, it very well is, because actually Hindu marriage is not between two genders, it is between two souls. And that it is very well possible that the two people who are marrying, even though as same sex in this lifetime, were probably together as opposite genders as well in a previous lifetime. So actually, he's not going beyond the Hindu dharma and the Hindu way of looking at marriage in presiding over a same-sex marriage. So one aspect is that, and she has also worked. Ruth Vanita has also worked on suicides by same-sex couples, and when in talking about attempts to suicide or when people have committed suicide, the lovers reiterate that the love is strong enough to be realized in another lifetime, that if not in this one, and they argue that it is their undying love for each other that defines them and their life, not their sexuality or body. Now, my limited argument in giving you these examples is that the LGBTQ community and the movement for their acceptance in contemporary life has actually reacquainted us, has brought back in public domain the rich and deep meanings of love as captured by mythology. Not only has this movement brought about legal changes and hopefully societal ones, but crucially, it has highlighted the many meanings of love, its essence and depth beyond the constraints of gender, duty, sacrifice, and even life. Finally, I would like to bring out, this isn't as much developed, but I want to bring out the power of media, particularly TikTok and other social media forums as Instagram and Snapchat and other digital forums that particularly students have come up with, that allow content from grassroots levels to be uploaded and circulated. Now, there is no doubt that social media can be misappropriated, and there is ample of evidence to show that misinformation is circulated through WhatsApp and rumors are fueled, causing deaths and riots, no doubt. At the same time, I believe that social media can also be incredibly democratizing, allowing for expressions of thoughts, discussions, at times anonymously. And this can be of great value and comfort to several people. Now, in my short academic career so far, and in my experiences of being at universities and interacting with students, I have seen how on these anonymous, particularly social media platforms, students, for instance, have come out. They have shared their experiences of cross-dressing or of being in the closet or so on and so forth. And in that sense, media in this sort of bottom-up way is also providing immense support to several people who want to challenge grand narratives that I began talking about, the grand narratives of what is an ideal couple, what is an ideal wife, right? Now, of course, we know of this by studying works such as by James Scott, who has told us about little resistances, as well as in the field of gender. Listening to Heron's Birds is one of my favorite works by Gold and Raheja, where they talk about how actually folk songs provide the kind of strength to women to challenge patriarchal order. And of course, we have Karuna Chanana, we have Patricia Oberoi, who's here today, who has also talked about various ways in which women resist, and Patricia Jeffrey and Roger Jeffrey, and so many scholars, sociologists who have looked at the ways in which women resist grand patriarchal structures. And my limited point here is that in my understanding, I have seen that the Indian public, not just women, but also Indian public have used their creativity, have used media, whether documentary or social media, and of course, social movements as LGBTQ are beginning to provide more inclusive narratives of love and marriage and conjugality. And that is quite inspiring. Of course, with my interlocutors, there wasn't a very honest and very strong resistance or a counter narrative to this. Nonetheless, they were questions, they were questioning and wondering if the everyday lexicon, if in their everyday lexicon, there are other figures that are more appropriate to understanding their anxieties and their desires of intimacies and marriage. I just want to conclude by saying that the personal is political, and we as sociologists are aware of it, from rules and regulations to marriage, sex, sexuality, intimacy. Every aspect of our personal life is in the political domain. And when the political rhetoric is heightened, surveillance on our personal life is also increased. We are a land of Khap Panchayats and fueling fears of love jihad, no doubt. But we also have a repertoire of meanings of love that can equally assert and challenge the established heteronormative gender constraining ideals of conjugal love. Sita does emerge as a potent figure, no doubt she's an important figure, but not always uncritically. Women are aware that there is more to mythology than Sita, Draupadi, and Radha, that there exists also Mandodari. I haven't even gone into that part of that, Mandodari and Padmavati, and feisty masculine princesses who do not always see love as sacrifice or duty or subservience or for their husband. Just that our everyday lexicons need to challenge these grand political heteronormative discourses. And for this, we do not need to look to the West or place our bets on some far-sighted idea of modernity. Instead, we simply need to turn to our past and remember also that Hindu gods can change gender, that each god has a female Shakti, an equal partner, if you will, that provides potency to rule the world like Shiva Shakti, and that they are most powerful in their androgynous forms, for instance, Shiva the Ardhanareshwar or Lakshmi Narayan. Now, isn't that the power of gender egalitarian conjugal love? Okay, thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much, Parul, for this very interesting lecture, and also delivered in a very lucid manner. This Indian mythologies, they always amaze you. They throw distinguished characters and their relationship that have not lost their relevance to present times. And also these characters, they challenge some of the grand narratives that suit the present political dispensation. And the present times is besieged in India, particularly with attempts to impose some grand patriarchal structures. Okay. And they try to misappropriate my thoughts. So I'm not kindly switch off your mute your Priya Soni. Yeah. So I'm not going to summarize the lecture. Rather, I would like to now open the session for questions. And as usual, I would like to go to Professor Shiv Prasad.
Thank you very much. I think it is a beautiful way you have put it, bringing old mythological and contemporary, because that's what also happens in politics. Politics, they bring in somebody whom they wanted to project as wicked. They'll compare with Ravan. Whereas Ravan, for some tribal communities, is like a god. and Sita as an epitome of sacrifice, they'll show. But how Sita is suppressed, in fact, there are beautiful writings in Telugu. One of the very well-known Telugu writers, she talked about, actually there was a writing by Jnanapita Award winner. This is Ramayana Kalpavruksham, that's called. Then the opposite of that was written as Ramayana Visavruksham. It is really a suppressive kind of narrative for women. That's what.
Would request everyone to kindly mute your microphone, except the speaker. Kindly mute your microphone. Ayman Nisar.
Yeah.
Yeah, kindly mute your microphone.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, yes.
So what you find is in all our mythologies, whether it's Ramayana or Mahabharata, you have every aspect of relationships, every aspect of conjugality or love, or you can say the extreme of that again, like jealousies, all that. These are human tendencies which are depicted, which were true. In fact, you have matrilineality. Draupadi had 5 husbands, polyandry, and there are Krishna had consorts, and because there are stories saying that how he had in the past. In a previous this thing, he desired all the other fellows. They were all male. They wanted to marry him. So these are actually what they are dealing with is the kind of mental vibrations among the people. This is not necessary that you have to marry a man or you have to marry a woman. In fact, that is what is depicted. In fact, we are talking about the secondaries as if they're negative characters. In fact, they have an excellent role in the entire process of understanding. In some communities, even today, any good function is there, they are invited. See, the reason is most of it was accommodative. But then, as you rightly said, our political community always wanted to encash. Like the famous Ayodhya temple has become a center of attraction. And some people say, temple Ram, we never know, but Ram was born there. If that is the case, how is it that he, this thing is called Ayodhya, that is in Thailand. They believe that they still have Rama 1, Rama 2, Rama 3. They still believe Rama was from there. So these are all, you see, they capture the imagination of people because, like folklore, they are, each community attaches its stories into that. So you identify, this is identification of people. And in fact, it is very interesting because it's always contemporaneous, because it always tries to link the past with the present, and using that, other people wanted to dictate, this should be like this. This happened not only with the Hindu, it happens also with Islam and others, including even Christianity. So I think you have taken one set of religious texts. I think if you do that with other religious texts also and narratives, it would give a meta narrative of the whole thing. Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Professor Pushpendra, you're on mute.
Yeah, would you like to respond to this?
Yes, thank you so much. No, I completely agree with everything that you've said. And that's what was interesting to me. And of course, as I said, like in some ways, this isn't, I'm talking about just one subset of Indian population. And you're absolutely right that I was, when I was interacting with this one subset, I noted that it is just one grand narrative that they are, that they are relating to. And there is criticism, they're beginning to question it, particularly when men and women, as because one of the central arguments of my book is actually that for this generation and for this subset of the middle class population, because again, there are middle classes, but this particular middle class, the marriage is being delayed. So they're getting married little later, so late 20s, early 30s even, and profession becomes very important, a very neoliberal kind of identity. So in that process, when, for instance, when women have worked so much, they've studied so hard, and when they are, and there are these expectations, when they're asked, they begin to question, how do we, we grew up and in our house there's Ram Sita Puja always. So how does it really fit? How does it fit? And that's when I realized, and of course, this I think would be very interesting for scholars who are working on media, I think, and also social movements, I suppose many students or scholars here, that how it's so powerful, media, television, so powerful, and how again in the pandemic, as I said, right at the beginning, it was these two, apparently they were brought back with popular demand. Now, I don't know how popular the demand was, but we have to, so we were told that it was popular demand because of which they were brought back. And one can't help just think, is it more political than is it, so how is demand curated and things like that. Anyway, but thank you so very much for your comments. I completely, yes, I hear them. Thank you.
We have hands. First, Bhavya.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you so much for a wonderful lecture, Parul ma'am. It was really enlightening. I am not from sociology. However, I've been following spirituality and across many religions. My question to you is that, back then, in Vedas, we have found that India also experienced, a mindset called polygamy, and it was more for women rather than, it was like a woman can decide when she wants to end a relation with, her husband and then move on and marry someone else, right? So I'm really not sure whether what version of Vedas I have referred to, whether it was authentic or not. But then we come from, as you rightly put it, we don't have to go far to west, but then go back to the past and then refer to our scriptures to understand what we were and what was our mindset. Now, from that era to now, what basis we have found so far is that if we do not limit humans or people into institutions like marriage or a certain law, in terms of relationships, then we become like animals. So, I want to understand from you, because you are an expert into this, that what role does lust or sexuality play into the definition of love, which is far beyond these physical things, that actually, maybe that is why that drives it into political domain. Yeah, over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Bhavya. It's such a wonderful question. But before anything, I just want to say I don't consider myself an expert on many things. So let me give you an answer to this. Actually, what you have flagged is something that is precisely driving my current research, which is what is love. And it's actually thanks to Professor Sabyasachi, who's present here today, that I'm also exploring this further. Because what you have mentioned about what is the place of lust in love is, I think, an incredible point of inquiry, particularly because in these grand narratives, just to link it to the talk, in these grand narratives, and I call them sanitized versions of love and conjugality, sex barely comes up, lust barely comes up as a point of discussion, right? And in fact, when it does, for example, for Surupnakha, who was really desired Lakshman, it's something that one shouldn't do, right? Now, let me try and answer this, because it is something that I too am figuring out. But let me try and answer this by giving you examples of what my interlocutors say, which is that, and this is something which is actually in my book. The first chapter of my book actually is this, that for now, for a great number of people, now, okay, I'll give you a caveat of that, but for now, for this particular section of the middle class, lust, love, and conjugality are separate things. Okay, so a lustful necessarily an immoral aspect. It is something that that happens, but it should be something, as you also mentioned, tamed. But it should be something, if not tamed, in marriage, because there are incredible number of people. So in fact, everyone that I interviewed has had premarital intimacies and sex. Quite a lot, right? So again, this is the whole thing about, I mean, I don't mean like just once over, but I mean, think of it where you're not married, but you're still engaged in intimacy. So you're experiencing very different kinds of intimacies, which are included, which are also lust, which are also about lust, which are also about sex. And there are people who sometimes think, that marriage is above and beyond that, because because lust is something that can end very soon. So that is a perception. But having said that, I juxtapose my developing thoughts on this, is that there are also kinds of lustful love, as in the bhakti movement. See, if you look at the songs of the bhakti movement, they're actually very explicit. And that is a eulogized love form as well, love between Radha and Krishna. My favorite, as you can see on the picture on my wall, a Madhubani painting of Radha and Krishna. The bhakti movements the bhakti movement songs are very much about this aspect of love. So again, the question is, what circumstances have made us think in these binaries of lust versus love versus marriage? So that is a sociological question that I'm interested in exploring. And my understanding, very premature understanding, is actually, it's linking to this thing what even Professor Prasad said right now, which is that it is about political spaces. It is about how you envision, how the ruling elites envision Indian nation, and how they want to, how they control discourses. For instance, which was in my lecture today, through the lens of the two televised series of Ramayana and Mahabharata. But if you ask me personally, I think lust needs to be tamed, or sex needs to be tamed. I think these are incredibly important aspects of love. And as humans, because you also asked a very kind of a biopsychological question, which I cannot really answer, but I think as humans, we also have the ability to categorize. And at times, in that sense, with Radha as well, it's considered the purest form, a form which actually goes beyond marriage. So actually, she challenges marriage, and yet it is she who's seen as Krishna's main consort. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're mute, Pushpendra. Unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so I see 5 hands raised here, and also there are 2 questions in the chat box. So before going to the chat box, let me first call Nisi Singh to raise her question. You are muted. You are on mute.
Thank you, Pushpen sir. Thank you for inviting me to such an interesting talk. And Parul, you were excellent and very lucid. So here I'm not actually posing a question, but actually together we are going to see, and we will agree also, that if we talk about Ramayana and Mahabharata, so probably Ramayana happened first. So when we are talking about women, because many of the guests today for this interesting discussion, they have also expressed their question that what is the current status of women? So if we see Ramayana, then Sita had a chance of Swayamvar, right? So choosing the life partner. I see you smiling, Parul. And then we see how she was abandoned by the king, so-called, on the issue of chastity. Right. So again, we see by the time that Ramayana must have been written and composed, the status of women must have diminished in the society. Right. So a lot of situation, what we see because of mythology actually lead us to believe is that position of women is sometimes based on the geography also. And then again, it becomes political. Why political? Because we have seen during Mahabharata that polyandry was also allowed, right? So that is what the position of women have been a kind of question. And what we believe that Shiva Shakti, when you talk about Shiva Shakti, at one point of time, the combination and the union was considered to be heavenly and more powerful. But as the ages have come and gone, I think women today are looked upon their bearing capacity, santati, was a very defining factor. The ability to give a santati to the men was a very important factor deciding their status in the society. And now I think it has degenerated into them being a commodity. That is what I say. And that is why whenever you have a question of Ram, whenever you write a book, whenever you create a movie, in the social arena, there's a lot of furor because they don't want to question the position of men, but always the question of position of women can be deliberated. That is what I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I absolutely, completely agree. In fact, so in the book, in the documentary, the animated film rather, that I talked about, Sita Sings the Blues, apparently the reason that the backlash happened for the film was because in that Ram was shown as, an unloving, uncaring husband who kind of, to juxtapose it to the modern story that, got a job offer, I'm just moving, yeah, you can follow me. And like, so in that sense, the film was actually questioning, as what you're saying, also slightly questioning the figure of Ram. So when the petition was signed and when all of this, when the Conjugality Smriti was actually going against them, that was the narrative that they were giving, that we are upset with this film because it's questioning Ram, right? So it was, it's him as the ideal, the Dharam Purush. So yeah, I absolutely agree. There's that aspect, and yes, even in my work, and I've written about this in my book as well. And then I remember each time I'm invited to speak on, the middle class, because the idea is that these are women who are working, these are women who are educated, these are women who have chosen to delay their age at marriage. So people keep asking this question, but these are modern women. But in one paper, actually, I've argued that very much what you're saying, which is that even though quote unquote modern women, the violence that they face, by the way, not just in marriage, but also in romantic relationships. I've written a paper on that as well. And in the office, in their romantic relationships, which is outside marriage. So what do? You go to a police station and say that I was beaten up by my boyfriend, not by my husband. The law still recognizes the husband violence, but not the boyfriend violence in that sense. So what I noted, which was really sad and disheartening, is that, as you are rightly pointing out, that, the position of women is, it's professionally, it's increasing, but there's so much work to be done socially. And even in these modern couples and even in this modern conjugal life, there are these questions. Having said all of this, I just want to say, and just because I also have come across some very heartbreaking stories that men have suffered as well, but I just want to kind of flag that as well, that in my work, I've come across men as well who have attempted suicides, who have gone, like therapy is something that's really becoming big, particularly in urban areas. And you'd find a lot of men that are also in therapy now, but that's for another kind of discussion. And I completely take your point.
And there's just one thing that I would like to say on LGBT and other relationships is that India, for that matter, was very open in terms of transgender or whatever relationships that exist. But somehow or the other, when we were taken up by the British, I mean, they have imposed in terms of writing, they were not so modern or open in these terms. So they were taken aback by the openness of Indian society. And that is why through writings, through various means, it has been inculcated into our minds that we were barbaric, we were backward. Otherwise, I think today's generation, they have not read such literature. So they are very open-minded, and these concerns are taken care of and raised.
Absolutely. I completely agree. In fact, also to the previous comment as well about Hijra community continues to be important, but also I just want to kind of say that because this talk, I've focused more on these texts and therefore on Hindu mythological lore, but also the Hijras had a very important place, by the way, in the Mughal court. So they were the only ones who could actually traverse between the Zanana and the Mardana.
Yes,
so actually they had even in the court of Shah Jahan, Jahanara's
and they
kind of
politically
confidant
were very important.
Yes, exactly. So they had actually all the political power, and they were the main channels of communication between the Aurangzeb and Jahanara and everyone. So yeah, so even in that context, and you're absolutely right, it was all the Victorian era being prude, which was imposed on us. Yes.
Yeah, before going to Tejkar Jhaji, I would like to just read two questions which are in the chat box. One is by Swati Singh. She's saying why you say characterize riding a horse or doing archery as masculine. That's the question she's raising.
Right.
And then there is another question. Let me read that question. There are more actually. One is that this is by Arundhati Singh. She says that was keen to know about your views on Chandrabrati's Ramayana with respect to love separation ideas as interpreted in folk versions of Ramayana. Okay. Let's take these two questions first, and then we have more questions in the chat box, and we will go to Tejkar Jhaji after that.
So,
your voice is sometimes breaking, Parul.
I didn't mean to say that. Is it better now?
Yes.
Is it? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. I don't know how. So Swati, no, I didn't mean to kind of say that horse riding is masculine, but what I meant and what I read about Chitrangada was that she was brought up, again, as we can figure out, because she was supposed to be the heir to the throne. So she was brought up as more like a warrior princess who was trained in these arts. And actually Arjun was attracted to that and not the feminized version of that. So, but I haven't gotten deep into, I'd read it in passing. I think it was actually Vedat Patnaik spoke about how the transformation, or when she not converted, but when she became more feminized. I think it was written there. But the main folklore is that, again, because obviously there wasn't any son that Chitravahana had, so she was kind of brought up as like this princess who was more focused on being a warrior princess. And actually, that is what attracted Arjun to her. But I don't mean that horse riding is only supposed to be done by men. And the other, I'm not aware. I'm not aware of this version of. I haven't read this version of Ramayana. I think the second question. So, so I'm sorry. I wouldn't want to sound silly by commenting on it.
Okay. So next, I would go to Tejkar Jhaji. I think yes. Yes, Tejkar ji.
First of all, I express my gratitude and thanks to Dr. Parul for giving this excellent lecture to us. and that too in honor of my father. I'm really indebted. Now coming to the topic. This topic of marriage, sexuality, and relationship was very dear to him. We had to discuss this topic many times. He was examining the writings of Iravati Karve and the characters like Sita, Draupadi, and many other similar characters in the mythology also. But that I came to know through his notes that he has left. But I'm sorry that he could not complete that work. Now, coming to this point of your lecture, I think that memorial, there shouldn't be any questions and any discussion after the memorial lecture. But since you are allowing, I take this opportunity. Now, Dr. Parul has limited her thesis to the middle class society residing in the metros. Now, what I have perceived in my life and through readings, that society has in India is basically, we have all the three societies which Marx classified. We have the peasant society living in the rural area. We have modern urban society, not based on entirely on industrial society, but to an extent, depicting their model family system, that is husband, wife, and children. No grandparents living with them. No large families being there. Joint families, I mean. And then we come to the tertiary economy cities like Bangalore, where they are having these large service sectors where lakhs and lakhs of people are working together in the same building and living in the same locality. Now they have a different time, they have a different orientation towards the family life and marriage, especially interpersonal relationship as regarded in marriage. Family is moving from joint family structure towards single parent or single member family. You get to meet your so-called spouse, a spouse at home and a spouse at work, have your sexual relationship with somebody and have your mental relationship with somebody else also. Now these are being seen in all sorts of society. Coming to the phenomenon that is impacting in the most severely our society is the advent of this mass media, or you can say that the media that we are having right now in our palm, that is your mobiles. Literature, previously when we were children, we used to talk about Ramayana or Mahabharata only what we had heard as stories from our grandmothers. Now, after that, the TV came and we started to view the serials, Mahabharata and Ramayana, and that serial showed only the things as selected by the director and the producer. Now again, now we are having OTT serials and all sorts of things are going on. So what has impacted this relationship pattern? What has impacted the marriage patterns? And what has impacted the our conception of love and romance and sexuality? Secondly, as far as Sita and Ram is concerned, I don't think that at least in my region, that is Mithila, Ram was never considered to be God. You cannot find a single Rama or Sita temple till, say, last 200 years. Whatever temples are there of Ram and Sita are recent ones. So Ram was made into a god essentially in North India by Tulsidas, not by others. As far as sexuality is concerned, yes, everything was there. You have to go and see them in the literature that has been produced down the ages, like Kalidas's Abhigyan Sakuntalam or Raghuvans Mahakavyam. They have vivid descriptions, and the land of Kamsutra, it has enormous amount of literature in Sanskrit and other languages, which depict of different forms of sexual relationship in this society. But exceptions don't make a rule. That is one thing. We can discuss it, and I'm very enlightened to know the views of the Dr. Parul on the middle class, and especially middle class living in the topmost urban cities and their connect with Ram and Sita. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. And I'm really grateful that you've attended the lecture and that you found it interesting. Really, I'm really glad that I got the opportunity to speak on a memorial for your father. And I completely take your points that there are so many different gradations in Indian society. And the way the images are circulated. I mean, even with OTT platforms, that's something that I wish more people can research, that they also capture a particular audience, you know, like a very kind of metropolitan audience as well. So it'll be very interesting for us to read more research coming out of how, so like my generation grew up watching B.R. Chopra and, you know, Ramanand Sagar's renditions of these epics. It'll be very interesting to see what are the renditions of the OTT platforms, because obviously they reach also to a global audience, not just the Indian audience, because Doordarshan reached to the obviously Indian audiences. So it'll be a very fascinating aspect. I completely agree, and it would be very interesting to know how the other kind of segments of Indian society also navigate through the mythological texts. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Before I go to another question in the chat box by Prabhas Ranjan, let me first finish the three persons who have, the three people who have raised their hands is Sabyasachi, Prashant Trivedi, and Samir Chaturvedi. So first, Professor Sabyasachi.
Thank you, Parul. बहुत बढ़िया, बहुत अच्छा लगा. Just a little question for you to consider. Have you heard of Ram, Sita, and Radha in live-in relationships and with single mothers?
So in live-in relationships, Radha, yes. Single mothers I haven't researched, but live-in relationships, yes. It is also, Radha is actually invoked quite a lot, particularly when they're not transformed.
How does that work? I mean, what kind of discussion do they have? Because live-in relationships actually give up conjugality that comes through marriage.
Exactly. Therefore, Radha becomes quite interesting. I mean, so in the limited people that I've interviewed so far that are in live-in relationships, of course, they completely upend and question the Ram Sita duo, because that's in the institution of marriage. And actually, for them, it's Radha Krishna, so which is invoked a lot more. That it is actually, you don't need to be in the institution of marriage to love someone. And love also encapsulates sexual relationships. So what is the shame in living in? Because one of the things, I mean, that's for a separate thing, but like one of the reasons why people, for instance, don't give out apartments to couples that are not married is because they are apparently, outraged at the idea that can be having sexual relationships so quote unquote openly that they decide to live in. So that is something, so in that context, definitely the idea of love that's prominent. Also because sometimes these couples in the paper that I was mentioning about violence, so actually some of these and the women and then the women say that they feel like Radha in the sense that it could never translate to marriage. But of course it was violence, which is not like Radha, but yes. But I wouldn't know about single mothers. Yeah, that's something that would be very interesting. Thank you.
So the next question by Professor Prashant Trivedi.
First of all, thank you very much, Parul, for such an interesting lecture. I wish to submit a very small point is that you talked about several characters in Ramayana and Mahabharata and other mythological characters. I wish to submit that I see that in India, the entire history of India before the advent of colonialism, it has been very different society altogether as far as the question of sexuality is concerned. And even in that society, the question of sexuality was dealt very differently in different communities also. If you look at different castes, for instance, Dalits had a very different, and the Adivasis have a very different take on the question of sexuality as compared to the so-called landed caste and the landed so-called upper caste. So the characters which are we are talking about were not the exception, but the everyday life, the question of sexuality in everyday life was very different before the advent of colonialism, which actually privileged the so-called upper caste Brahminical way of looking at it and freezed it further here from there onwards. Otherwise, before that means I thought it's very different. Means the land itself was very different. Means particularly among Dalits and Adivasis was dealt very differently.
Yes, I absolutely agree. In fact, in a way, like what I've talked about today is to show that which was kind of previously discussed in another comment, that we've actually come a long way, and I would say a wrong way. So we started off quite well, and absolutely, colonialism played an incredibly important role in distilling a sanitized and, as you said, I would say Brahminical way of looking at things. And the point essentially was this, as I was trying to make in the part 3 of the lecture, that it has been carried on as well with the political regimes this way or that way since a long time. So actually, I find great strength and great hope through social movements and media, because in part 3, that's what I was discussing. So you have an animated film by an Indian American, you have LGBTQ movement, and you have what I see in universities, students, uploading through TikTok and things like that. So actually, in a way that, and through my discussion on my interlocutors, that they're beginning to question. So in a way, yes, you're absolutely right. The narrative has been structured since colonialism, then through the formation of Indian nation state up until neoliberal times. And one of the ways in which these narratives will be challenged is also by being more inclusive, because you're absolutely right. It isn't, you bring in stories from other cultures, from other caste groups, from other tribal groups as well, and you give them space, and then they come up, and then hopefully we have a bit more heterogeneous lexicon, and not this lexicon. Yes.
Thank you. We have then the next question by Samir Chaturvedi.
Hello, Parul.
Hello, Samir. Very nice to see you here.
Acha, Parul, I have a question because I am working on similar area. So, as in, probably I am extending your own argument. As in, when it comes to having relationships with a person with a disability, okay? So, like if a woman talks about duty and personifies Sita in terms of never having sex, or even not thinking about having sex, right? But when it comes to accepting proposals of disabled men, especially, then the very essence of duty uh, and sacrifice probably goes for a toss. Like as you mentioned that those neoliberal ethos comes and like basically my respondents who are men with certain disabilities have experienced it, that those women who are otherwise very traditional, dutiful, but when it comes to accepting our proposals, they are exactly same like any other quote unquote metro oriented woman. So yeah.
Samir, what do you mean metro-oriented woman? Like, so
like
in the sense they reject the proposal?
like as in not being like metro oriented, it is to give a sense that they never they never even realize that there is a men with disabilities who are even present in their surroundings, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
so like some of my respondents or even friends have experienced that they uh, at the end they experience same kind of emotions with these quote unquote dutiful women also, who personify Sita at at one level, but act as as a woman of today's generation on the other level. So yeah.
Thank you so much for this, Samir. As you know, that I haven't. I'll just say one thing. It's very interesting that you take this point, and in some ways, it's revealing, even in my work, in that I actually didn't come across any woman who has even ever dated a man with disability. So, in that sense, there is in the absence of this data point in my research, there's a lot that can be said. But beyond that, I really do take your point, and actually, I'm looking forward to your research because I think it's a very anyways, disability studies is something that sociology must focus increasingly on. And I think its intersection with love and intimacy and even just dating would be incredibly revealing of not only, as you said, how gender ideals are produced and reiterated, but also perhaps if there are any double standards that they circulated with. So thanks so much, Samir, for this
Yes,
comment.
Parul, we have one question. We have to end also. So there's
Okay.
one question by Mohammed Fojail, and then there are comments by Professor Prabhas Ranjan. But let me read this question by Mohammed Fojail. Do you believe that time has come to liberate the institution of marriage from the institution of religion, which has politically enslaved the former? This could be very much relevant when love is given the prefix of jihad.
It's an incredibly great question. I think I think we can hope for the institution of marriage to be separated from so many other institutions as well, and I think it would flower and blossom quite well. But to be practical and to be, I think I'm a bit more pessimistic in this, and I feel I don't know when all of this can happen. We are all, how do I put this? In my research as well, I found, and I make this argument, which at least people of my generation do not like, is that I find my generation, the millennial generation, to be far more conservative than the previous generations in terms of their spousal choices. And this is in terms of caste and religion. So it was upon me, then yeah, it should have been without caste and without religion and all of that. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen very soon, maybe the next generation.
And Prabhas Ranjan has given his comments. These are not questions, but in the form of comments. He says that middle class has inherited the Victorian legacy transferred through modern education. The Indian tradition do not disgrace lust, as calm is equal status as other three. Temples were decorated with explicit images. Then in his next comment, he writes, the division of activities into masculine and feminine is socially sensible. Even the modern action movies with female protagonists are analyzed not as female achievements, but for the gaze of male chauvinist lust in academic analysis. And in the last comment, he says, there are 300 Ramayana versions across different areas and cultures, so it can not be credited to Tulsidas only. Modern popularity of Ram among middle class is due to the Gita Press publication, as beautifully described in the book with the same name by Akshay Mukul. These are his comments.
Yes, I totally agree. And then just to the last absolutely right. But also we have to remember, I think Professor Sabyasachi, you would remember this. It was it 2008 or 9 or somewhere where the essay 300 versions of Ram was banned from the history syllabus in DU. So I mean, while they do exist, so that is another point, right? Of course they do exist, but the question is, are they allowed to be circulated? And that's really the essence of the point. Like when I started with the part 1 of the lecture, that there are so many of these narratives, but who do they reach to? Why are they restricted? How are they restricted? And if things are going to be cut off from syllabus, then so that is one example. I absolutely agree with you that what the television is giving us, or what was given to us in these 2 televised ways, was of course a restrictive narrative, and students weren't even allowed to read that essay, which has the 300 versions of Ramayana. I completely agree that it is, yes, all of it is geared towards, much of the television is geared towards a male gaze. I completely take your points, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Parul. This time to now close this lecture program. Tejkarji has rightly said that generally in a memorial lecture, there is no question answer session. But because your lecture is also part of a commemorative volume in respect of Professor Hetukar Jha, and you requested that you wanted to have some questions so that you can work on it, on them. So I actually broke from the general tradition and allowed this question answer session in this lecture program. So I must thank you very much for this very insightful and very interesting lecture, and also to everyone who raised their question, who participated in this program. We have already passed 6 minutes, 4:30, but still we are here. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor. And to everyone for all your comments, and thank you so very much for supporting this.
Thank you.
Lovely, Parul. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. Okay. So we end here.
I just wanted to say one thing. It's actually it's good to look at different, as someone mentioned, the tribal communities and because beauty doesn't matter there.
Yes.
And I also know one of my distant relatives' grand aunt was a cripple.
Yeah.
She was married because those times you had bride price.
Yes.
People had to earn some money to buy a woman for marriage. So there were times where also regional wise there are, of course, this was a big movement against bride price, which turned into the other one, which is worse than that.
Yes.
So you have different movements which get into that. I think it's essential to look at diverse societies, and I think what theorization will be much more broader to do that. Thank you very much. It was wonderful.
Sure. Thank you.
And I also am reminded of the liberal society that was, say, during the Mahabharata. Kunti belonged to a Yadav community and married to a different community. So the kind of, say, the liberal, say, environment in terms of even caste.
Yes.
So, okay, but we have to now end here. It's so interesting. we can go on discussing this. So thank you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.